Continuing on with Lecture 20, here we are with the crisis of the 3rd century. And so the crisis of the 3rd century, of course, was during the entire 3rd century. It kind of started a little bit during it at the beginning and lasted a little bit afterwards. But roughly the year 200 to the year 300 was what we're talking about for this crisis. And of course, we've already talked about the main things that end up happening it quickly, just that these are the main 5 things that happened during it. So let's actually talk about each of them. And so here we are with political instability, and it's political instability across the entire empire. When you've got constantly emperors declaring themselves as, or army leaders declaring, or governors declaring themselves as emperors all across the empire, we constantly have these problems. And so obviously these ones, as well as others, from before, and all end up having to do with this issue of constant fighting with at least 26 different people claiming to be emperor, really more than that even. It's just how many of them actually claim to be emperor as opposed to tried to become emperor and then failed fighting the person that they were trying to take the emperorship from. So roughly 26 we can go with is a decent number, okay? We also know that there was no expansion of the empire during this period, and that is because really what's all the army doing? They're fighting each other. The Roman legions are fighting each other. That's what all of these barracks emperors are doing. They're having their own legion or 2 or more to back them, and then they go and fight another 1 or 2 legions or more in battle. And it might be multiple battles. It might be against not just one enemy that's declared himself emperor, but multiple guys that have declared themselves emperor, and you're trying to hang on to you claiming your emperor and stuff with your army. Some of the troops end up just killing their leaders and deciding to nominate another guy as leader when the first one failed. And so there's no expansion going on, okay, during this, because the army is just too busy doing all this fighting, so that there's no new slaves brought into the empire at this time. And one of the things about Roman slavery as opposed to American slavery is Roman slavery really wasn't where the offspring would become a slave as well, like in America was how it was legislated as laws here during the 1700s to 1800s. And so when a slave dies or has children, those kids, once they're able to fend for themselves and grow up and are adults, they are no longer slaves in the Roman Empire. And so there's no more slaves coming into the empire because the empire really only got slaves from expanding and conquering new territory. There's some slaves, of course, happening because of going into debt and stuff, but it's not as much as when you would conquer an area. And so there's no real expansion, no new slaves for the empire as well during this period. Less cultivation is going on. Less cultivation, meaning less farming, okay? Much of the land was laid waste to through all of these various wars and the civil war of the barracks emperors, okay? And so you've constantly got all of these civil wars going on, and fighting going on, and when enemies such as those on the Danube and stuff start invading again and all, we end up having what happened? The land itself, the farmland, just gets completely wrecked. Okay, and food is also taken by the armies of the barracks emperors, taking literally every single crop behind and leaving every single crop with them when they get to a farm or a plantation or something like that. They get to an area of farms and towns, and they just pick every single crop that's ready to go and just take it with them, and eat it themselves and move on. Leaving nothing to start crops with the next season. Because what people would do, farmers do even today, is when they farm things, they end up taking the seeds and some of what's left from the crop and use the seeds to start planting for the next year's crop or the next season's crop. And so when everything is literally taken by the armies of the barracks emperors just marching on through, they literally have nothing, the farmers literally have nothing to plant with. Many of the farmers and stuff worked for large landowners, and only grew enough for themselves with subsistence farmers. Many people in the empire worked for these big, giant patrician-owning, massive plantation-owning patricians, and then they would have their own little kind of little backyard farm, enough to survive on themselves, and then barely anything else. And barely even grew enough to survive at times. They didn't have enough to grow enough for the rest of the empire. So people in the empire were also starving, and we're going to talk about causing inflation and stuff in that in a minute. We also have, during this period of time, during the less cultivation, is one of the things that the army did is flat fields that the farms were made on, okay, and all the farming was grown on. Those are perfect places to have big battlefields. Okay, and so the army would not only just pick all of the crops, they would also basically stomp on the field and have a battle on the field. Sometimes they would even kill the farmers if the farmers refused to give their crop to the army. And so it really gets to these major problems where the armies of the barracks emperors are just basically hurting eventually the entire empire themselves, because they're either eating all the food or killing the farmers, or battling on the farmland and then ruining the farmland through battle and stuff like that. We also have a mini ice age and tax collection issues during this time. So let's talk about both of them. Mini ice age. Global temperature changed by 1 degree. 1 degree. I know that doesn't sound a lot, but it is. 1 degree is actually massive on a global scale. And the reason why is because even though it's a temperature change of only 1 degree, it actually shortens the growing season of the year. And so if your growing season is sometime during the spring, let's say middle of March, okay? Middle of March, and you grow crops to, say, October, okay? Because anything after October is just too cold, and all the plants need to be picked by then or they'll die in the cold. Okay, just say we'll go March to October. 1 degree change can make it so that October you can't even pick anything in because it's just too cold at that point, and all the plants have died because they start dying at the end of September. Or even earlier, maybe middle of September. Okay, is when you have to pick your crops, or they're all dead because the plants just die because it's already snowing. When it would maybe snow until October. And then also, normally you plant in March, middle of March. Well, let's say it's too cold in March still. The winter frost and the winter snow hasn't melted in March, and might not even melt until middle of April. About a month or so on either side has just been lost, which means what happens to the plants when you do grow them? Well, they're not going to be able to grow for as long. That's about a month on either side that they're just not going to be able to grow. So that's basically 2 months gone of being able to grow. And so the plants are going to be smaller, the crops, that is, that you would eat. And so that's going to be an issue. Some crops might not even grow some years unless they've got a certain amount of time to grow, and things like that. And so this colder and shorter growing season really becomes a major issue. This mixed with the already less cultivation because of all the farming issues with the soldiers stomping on everything as well as taking everything, really ends up causing a major problem with this mini ice age and this less cultivation, where there is even now less food for the entire population of Rome. People are starving in droves during this period. And this mini ice age was completely natural. The world goes through temperature and climate change naturally. Okay, we are actually on the way into a mini ice age, but because of actual science of global warming, which is actually kind of a thing, because of the industrial age, we're not cooling down. We're actually getting slightly hotter, and that's why the ice caps and everything are melting. And that is just pure science. That is not political issue, that is science. And we go through mini ice ages multiple times in history. This is one of the first big ones that we have record of. There were some earlier on that I didn't really mention because we're not exactly sure if it was issues in Egypt or Sumeria and just those areas and not the rest. But later on, there's going to be another one or two during the medieval period, which we cover in this class. One leads to a massive, massive famine across all of Europe. But this one right here, this mini ice age, again, is just the same. People are starving. People are beginning to have famine. In fact, also at the beginning of American history, when America was first a country, we first had another mini ice age for a degree change for about 5-10 years. And it caused problems in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And it caused issues then for farming with technology of farming then, let alone, several hundred, about 1,000 plus years earlier with this in the 200s to 300s. And so it's just constantly happening. Minor ice ages, and then things get warmer again, and things go back to normal. And then things get colder again. But 1 degree actually changes the growing season by about a month on either side. And that is crucial to having crops planting and growing enough. And if you have less crops grown because they're not big enough, you're eating the whole thing and you're not leaving any extra seeds and stuff behind, because sometimes you eat the actual seeds, like corn and stuff, and grain. Those are the seeds we actually make the things out of to eat. And so you're not actually able to use it for growing the next year. So major issue. Tax collection also became a major issue during this period. Tax collection problems. Fewer taxes were collected because the people that would normally be taxed were constantly being called up to war. The people were constantly being forced to go and fight in the wars, as opposed to actually being able to pay their taxes at home, because they just weren't at home. They were now drafted into the military, or starving, and had nothing really to be able to pay for their taxes. And so they fell into debt. And some yes, became debt slaves, but not necessarily all of them. Currency at this time becomes worthless, almost across the entire empire. There is inflation after inflation after inflation of products and crops, especially food, going up through the roof, where things go, several times the amount. So maybe you could buy a loaf of bread for 1 sesterce. A few weeks later, or a few months later, maybe it's 2 sesterces. Maybe a few weeks or months or even a year later, it's 3 or 4 sesterces, or even more. Whereas at a point where your money, you just don't have much of it, and it's just basically becoming worthless. And so what are you going to have to do? Get goods and get food with? You're going to trade. You're going to start trading instead of actually buying and selling things. You're going to just trade directly for a product you make for another product someone has that you need. And it wasn't always desire, it's need, not desire. And inflation basically became across the entire empire. Well, eventually, as we said on this slide right here with the barracks emperors, right here, Carinus in 285 was one of the last barracks emperors. Eventually his rival Diocletian kills him in battle and defeats Carinus's army. So we end up having Diocletian come to the throne. And so let's talk about Diocletian. He lived from 244 CE to 305, and he was emperor from 284 to 305. Actually, that's a little bit wrong there. Don't worry about that. I think he lived a little bit later. I know he died soon after he retired, but we're going to talk about that in a bit. So first, let's talk about the barracks emperors. We've already talked about them, of course. Well, he is a barracks emperor. He is one of those generals where his army says, hey, we want you to be emperor. Or he says it, and then his army is like, yeah, we like you. And so he eventually decides to defeat Carinus, and then he marches on Rome, okay, in the year 284. Okay, marches on Rome, captures the city of Rome, the Senate makes him emperor, and he's the last of the barracks emperors. Any of the others have basically all fought themselves to death, and so he is the winner of the barracks emperor's civil war. And so at this point, he then starts making some big changes as leader and as emperor. He was originally from the Danube region. That's where he was originally from. Okay, he was born along the Danube area, probably Dalmatia. He starts actually deciding that he is going to start demanding people not call him imperator, but call him dominus, which means lord. translates to Lord. So Dominus was his title. Even though he was the emperor, he liked being called Lord, as opposed to anything else. He started many Eastern traditions in the Roman Empire at that point. He started actually making purple everywhere, using purple for everything royal and imperial for him. So we end up having more use of the color purple, which is kind of more of an Eastern thing. And again, we already know where purple comes from. It comes from the oysters and the clams from, remember, the city of Tyre. And the Romans had kind of used purple a little bit with their Praetorian Guard and stuff by this time, but he full-on does the purple all the way. On everything. He lived in the East as emperor, and we'll talk about that during the Tetrarchy, which we'll talk about in a bit, but he decided to live in the East rather than in Rome itself. He also was treated as a religious figure as Rome, while as emperor, and it's more of he demanded to be treated as a religious figure, and he started stomping out other religions, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. He also, more importantly, created many economic reforms, including a land tax, a tax on people that had large amounts of land. This ends the small farmer. Small farmers could not pay, okay? They were broke already and barely surviving as their own. So the small farmers are basically gone because of this economic reform that Diocletian starts with this land tax. And so they have to sell their land to larger farms to be on these big, and basically become workers for these larger farms. He also ends up making merchants in charge of collection of taxes. He realizes the merchants, the people that trade constantly, are the ones that interact with tons of people. So make them be the ones that are in charge of tax collection, because they already know how much people can buy and afford. And he tells them, you can keep the extra. I'm going to tell you an amount based on what your area should be able to do. And you have to come up with the difference. If you are not able to enforce the tax collection yourself out of your own pocket, you have to pay for out of your own pocket. But if you are able to get even more money than I ask you for, you get to keep it. Okay? And so that actually makes these merchants very invested into making sure that they get a little bit more, and stuff, and aren't having to pay out of pocket some years. He also freezes the occupations. As in, if your family member, your father, okay, is a farmer, you will also be a farmer. Doesn't matter if you don't like it, doesn't matter if you were already training to be in something else, you're now a farmer. If instead your family member, your father was a blacksmith, meaning that he worked with metal, that's what you're going to do. And your son will do that. And your son's son will do that, etc. Same with, say, if you were a merchant. That's what your family is going to do forever. You are going to be a merchant. Your child is going to be a merchant. Their child is going to be a merchant, on down. Carpenters, builders, farmers, etc. Pottery makers, anything. If your family was an occupation already, their descendants are going to be the occupation as well. Freezing occupations. Which can be good and can be also really bad, obviously. Okay? He also begins a cap on ceiling prices, a ceiling cap on prices where he does not allow inflation. Does not allow that loaf of bread to keep changing and going up in cost. He actually lowers things and he says, this is where it's going to be. So he deals with inflation and he starts making the economy start working because of all of this. But one of the things he does do with this land tax, okay, is he creates something called serfdom, or eventually what will become serfdom, because as well as the freezing of occupations. So if people were farmers, and they were a small farmer and owned a small farm, and they couldn't afford the land tax, they basically had to sell their farm to someone else, and because they were farmers, their occupation is frozen. They have to work as a farmer for the rest of their lives. So they're going to have to go to work for a big farmer family. Okay, that actually bought their land, or somewhere else that also has a bunch of need for new farm workers on their big giant plantations. And so, eventually, these people are frozen into their occupation as just poor farmers working for someone else. Eventually, in the medieval period, it becomes something known as serfdom, where these people are basically always working for the wealthy landowners or the nobles as serfs. S-E-R-F or S-E-R-F-D-O-M. is serfdom, okay? And we're going to talk more about that in several lectures' time. Let's talk a little bit more about Diocletian's reign. Diocletian also started having multiple campaigns. He had to fight against the barbarians along the Danube and Rhine regions. And the reasons why they're called barbarians is we might know them as like uncivilized people today, but actually the Romans are actually the reason why they're called barbarians. The reason why they're called barbarians is because anyone they really kind of didn't understand the language with, especially these uncivilized people or people they thought were very uncivilized, living out in these wilderness areas and Germany and stuff like that in Eastern Europe, they were called barbarians. And they got the name because the Romans, whenever they heard these people speak, they just heard ba, 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 ba. Kind of like if you don't like listening to someone, you're just like blah, 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 blah. It's kind of like that. And it's kind of wrong, but that's actually how we ended up getting the word barbarians in a way. Okay? I mean, there's a little bit more in there, but that's the basic way of how we got the word barbarian and how they started looking down on these people that they just thought were uncivilized and they just didn't care about learning their language. He also fought against the Sassanid Persians, or the Sassanids, which were this empire that kind of took over former Parthia. And eventually the Sassanid Persians are going to get beaten by another group of people. We'll talk about them in the future, though. But the Sassanid Persians are these people living out in the Middle East area and Mesopotamia area and Asia that are going to be a major threat to Rome for a little while. Diocletian kind of stops them for a bit, but other emperors will have problems against them. And then later on, other people will have problems against their successors, the people who eventually beat the Sassanids. Okay? So, bit of future for the future there. We also have something under Diocletian called the Great Persecution against the Catholic Church, because at this time it was really only the Catholic Church. Christianity was one church, Catholicism, okay? As we know it as the Catholicism today. And he first started confiscating books and other church items, such as their clothing, robes, stuff like that, altars, relics, such as like the cross and things like that, candles and things, and their gold jewelry and stuff that signify they're Christians and stuff, like gold crosses and stuff like that, okay? And things as anything of value, as well as all of their books and other items. He then furthered it by then going after the Christians themselves by forbidding them to be even able to come together and worship. If he found out their Christians were worshiping together, they were outlawed and arrested. And so when he started arresting them, he started interrogating church members, both the priests themselves as well as the members that just went to church, to get names of the people that also went to church and names of other priests and stuff. And so they were interrogated and killed, many of them, or just thrown in jail and never released. Diocletian is again one of those three basically emperors that really was against against religion, of the Christianity religion, that is. We talked about how Domitian did it as well, and we also talked before that about how Nero did it. So Nero, Domitian, and Diocletian are the big three emperors that really, really hated the Christianity religion, okay? And so because of them, Christians today kind of feel like, oh, Rome was always against Christianity. That is not the case. Most of the time they just did not understand it, and we're going to talk about that in the next lecture quite in detail, but really just know that Nero, Domitian, and Diocletian were the ones that were really against Christianity. Those three, okay? And in fact, definitely Diocletian. Major, major persecution of them, okay? And then, finally, he also starts realizing that the empire is just too dang big to govern himself, by himself as emperor. So he creates something called the Tetrarchy. So let's quickly discuss what the Tetrarchy is. The Tetrarchy was going to be set up with 4 people called the Tetrarchs, okay? 4 people called the Tetrarchs. Tetrarch basically means 4, okay? So the 4 Tetrarchs, and it was going to be 4 different emperors, okay? 2 emperors would be on top. 1 for the east, 1 for the west. Okay, so 1 for the east, So basically all of this purple area and this light purple area as well, and one for the west, these yellow and blue areas. Bluish green. Okay? Those are the two sides. West, east. Okay? Each of these emperors, one for the east, one for the west, was called an Augustus, hearkening back and honoring Emperor Augustus, the first emperor. Okay, that was their title. Their new title was Augustus. Not Imperator or anything, just Augustus. That was their new title. Okay, Diocletian would be in the east, because I said that he goes kind of over to the east. He realizes the east, okay, from like here onwards, is more valuable for resources. There's a lot more gold and spices out of the Middle East. There's gold and silver and other things out in the Asia Minor in the mountains. Egypt is extremely important because of the grain all produced in it, and stuff like that. And so this area, the east onwards, is very important resource-wise. And so he decides that he's going to move out to the east and be in charge over there, even though he's really in charge of everywhere. He's basically saying, I'm going to worry about this side of the empire, and you, Maximian, okay, Maximian is is going to be the Augustus of the West, okay? Maximian becomes Augustus of the West, and Diocletian becomes Augustus of the East, okay? And after that, each, Diocletian and Maximian, are to immediately choose someone that will follow up and become the emperor after them, or the Augustus after them, should they die, as well as also help Diocletian in the east and Maximian in the west. And so these two extra emperors are called the emperors in training, as I nickname, or called Caesar. Okay, they're called Caesar. Okay, their nickname is Caesar. And so Diocletian chooses a man named Galerius, okay, to help him rule. And so Galerius is going to be in this pinkish purple area and rule that area specifically, and Diocletian will rule this area, although Diocletian still technically is ruler of all of it, okay, and ruler of all of the East as well, but he's only going to constantly focus on the day-to-day issues of over here, and he's got Galerius helping out over here, and he's going to have the other guy, Maximian, with the West, choose a man named Constantius. Okay, so Constantius is the Caesar of the West, and Galerius is the Caesar of the East, and Diocletian is the Augustus of the East, while Maximian is the Augustus of the West. Okay, and so we've got Maximian and Constantius over here, and so Constantius is going to be in charge of this area, and Maximian in charge of these bluish-green areas. Okay, and then technically, Maximian has to make sure that Constantius is doing his job in these two areas as well. Okay? Just like Diocletian is making sure young Galerius is making sure everything is going okay here. And then Diocletian also has to worry about all of it as well. It just helps with a little bit by having, like, delegating other leaders to divide up the empire. Okay? So that's the tetrarchy. Okay? That 4 tetrarchs are going to help work together to make sure everything runs well. And remember, these guys are under these guys, okay? So the Augustuses are in charge with the Caesars in second command of each, okay? He also divides the empire up into 12 prefects, which you can kind of see in the little areas with the dotted lines. Don't worry about them. I'm not going to ask you about where they are. Just know that there's 12 of them, and that each of them become known as a diocese, okay? Eventually become known as a diocese, kind of a church along the church areas. Well, that's later on. He also divides the empire up into 100 smaller provinces, so several per prefect, okay, but 100 total smaller provinces, so that small governors can rule throughout all of them, like basically 50 on one side, 50 on the other, give or take. And so 100 throughout the whole area, 12 prefects really as the major districts, and then you've got really 2 main districts, east and west, with the half and half under each of that even there. So he's figured it out finally, how to rule the entire empire relatively peacefully as one person, and then realized, I can't do it by myself, I need help. And that's why he's got Maximian, and then he also has Galerius, and Maximian has Constantius to help. Okay? I know that's confusing. Take a look at this picture, this on the PowerPoint that I'm going to post on your file section, because it kind of grows. Unfortunately, it won't work on this PowerPoint video. I don't know why, but it just will not work for some reason on this. So, but it shows the empire growing from a tiny little kingdom here throughout all of the area, and then eventually dividing because of this, okay? And then eventually shrinking. Moving on, eventually in 305, Diocletian decides to abdicate from the throne. Okay, he decides that he is going to retire, and he retires to the modern-day city today named Split in present-day Croatia. Split is along the coast here. Okay, basically Dalmatia or Illyricum is where he goes to. It's along the coast of the sea here. It's a little port city. Eventually it becomes the big city of Split today in present-day country of Croatia. And he actually goes off there and he has this palace built. This is an artistic picture of it. This is actually a picture of one side of it. This is a picture of another side of it. Actually, this, I believe, is inside the courtyard, one of the courtyards areas. But this is a picture of it, and this is a picture from the front gate. And you can kind of see, like, these Egyptian writings and all, because he spent a lot of time in Egypt when he was governing this area of the East. So he kind of adopted a lot of Eastern ideas and stuff. And what he ends up spending his last couple of years or year or so doing as after he abdicates. He abdicates means he actually steps down from being emperor willingly. He decides he wants to retire, okay? He decides to start growing turnips. And it's kind of funny because one of my former professors and mentors actually went over and took these two pictures and sent them to me. He actually saw where the turnip field is. Unfortunately, the turnip field now has, like, something else built on it. So there's no able to be like, hey, here's a selfie with the turnip field. It's just turnip field was in here, out, like, around here, and also one or two inside. Because he really basically decided to go back just to go to humble roots and farm. He also, when he abdicated in 305, he told his co-Augustus, Maximian, you are going to step down too. No ifs, ands, or buts. Maximian, you are stepping down as Augustus, and you're going to promote Constantius, and I'm going to promote Galerius to be the Augustuses of the East and West. So Maximian and Diocletian both abdicate and step down. Maximian not so willingly, but forced to do it. And Constantius and Galerius both step up to the plate to become the new Augustuses, and both of them nominate someone else to be the new Caesars under them. And so, after Diocletian, okay, in 306, the following year, Constantius, the Augustus of the West, okay, because he was Caesar, now he's Augustus, okay, over all of it, and he had promoted one of his others to be a Caesar, he dies unexpectedly in Britain, in York, in Britain. York is a city in Britain, and he dies there, and actually, my dad is actually born in York. That's why I've got a funny accent. But Constantius dies in the city of York, unexpectedly of sickness, and his illegitimate son, Constantine, is proclaimed by Constantius' supporters and army as the next ruler. And they don't even make him just go all the way up to Caesar. They actually tell him, oh no, you're not going to just be Caesar and the other guy take over that Constantius had claimed as Caesar, Constantine. We want you as the army. We want you to be the new Augustus. So he is now Augustus of the West, even though there's another guy, the previous Caesar of the West, that should be promoted to it. Okay? And so you end up basically having the civil war break out amongst Constantine and Constantius' former Caesar. And then the other Caesars, because there wasn't Caesar, the other one declares themselves an Augusti, and another guy says, oh, I'm promoting you to an Augustus, that's why there's three, or I'm being a Caesar, no longer a Caesar, I'm going up to Augustus. So you've got multiple Caesars declaring themselves as Augusti, the plural form of Augustus, and then Maxentius, Maximian's son, who's not even anything at this time in the empire, decides that he is also going to declare himself as Augustus, and then finally, there's a total of 5 Augustus, or Augusti, now, including Constantine and Maxentius, all fighting and saying they are now the full ruler of all of the empire. And so we're going to talk about that craziness in the next lecture day 21, and who ends up winning that in lecture day 21, as well as a bunch of stuff about the early church.